Throughout the centuries, in war, politics, the economy, and all other types of activity, human beings used forgery and deceit to advance their goals. Our learned speaker tonight, in his book, The First Pagan Historian, documents how Darius the Phrygian tried to challenge the accounts of Homer and Virgil on the Trojan War. Darius simply fabricated his own story. Here at the House of European History, our entire current temporary exhibition, Fake for Real, explores these themes through a series of case studies from antiquity to modern times. One of them concerns the donation of Constantine. This is a forged Roman imperial decree by which the 4th century Emperor Constantine the Great supposedly transferred authority over Rome and the western part of the Roman Empire to the Pope. The donation of Constantine remained uncontested throughout the whole Middle Ages. Doubts started being expressed during the Renaissance, and in the 15th century, Lorenzo Valla, an Italian priest and humanist, proved the text was forged, and he proved it through a series of historical, philological, and legal arguments. Dear speaker, dear participants, the course of the donation of Constantine through time, from supposedly being the ultimate truth to being discredited and debunked, is often the common path forgeries follow. Yet, forgery and falsehood still flourish in our own time. Why, one might ask? How should critics respond to the ubiquity of forgery across historical periods? And what light can Renaissance scholarship and scholarship today shed on the situation in our era? Tonight, we will try to provide answers to these questions and to explore related themes. I would like to thank you once again for being with us, and I wish you a very fruitful debate. And for your information, the talk will be moderated by my colleague, Fake for Real curator Simina Badica, who will take your questions after the talk, so feel free to ask them through the YouTube chat. Professor Clark, now the virtual floor is yours.
I'm most grateful to the House of European History, not only for inviting me to speak, but also for assembling this wonderful exhibition on fakes and on forgery, which has contributed so much, not only to our understanding of what is a very pressing problem today, but also what has been a perennial phenomenon throughout human history. So today I'll take you on a tour that will include Lorenzo Valla and others, but I also hope will shed some light on our current situation in the present. And while I am sad, unfortunately, that I was unable to visit Fake for Real in person, it has been a real delight to explore the exhibit digitally, and I'm thrilled to be here virtually today in what is my California morning and your Brussels evening. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So in the past few decades, academic scholarship on forgery has proliferated, so much so that we might be able to refer to something like forgery studies as a coherent field or discipline. Here are just a few examples, beginning with Anthony Grafton's 1990 study, Forgers and Critics, and which now include studies of forgery or fakes in particular historical contexts. So for instance, Irene Perano's study of the rhetoric of the Roman fake, or Bart Ehrman's study on forgery in early Christianity. Forgery has also become a subject in the library and the museum world. Here to just give one example, the library at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore now boasts a collection of fakes and forgery, wonderfully titled the Bibliotheca Fictiva, or the Fictive Library. And it has a fascinating catalog, which I encourage you to peruse. And finally, of course, last but not least, the exhibit here at the House of European History on Fake for Real. Now, as Anthony Grafton eloquently made clear in his study, Forgers and Critics, we cannot understand the relationship, we cannot understand forgery without understanding another operation that stands in a kind of dialectical relationship to it, and that is criticism, the interpretive practices that are developed to determine if a text really was what it said it was. And defining criticism is perhaps as difficult, as nettlesome, as defining forgery. The term possesses a bewildering semantic range today. For one, it refers to a branch of academic study. In this case, the adjective that we also often associate with it is literary. The literary critic interprets literary fiction or poetry, sometimes through so-called critical theory. Sometimes the adjective critical is paired with the noun distance. Keeping one's critical distance implies not letting emotions or passions or anger, etc., obscure the work of rationality. Yet in ordinary language, there is some slippage, because the adjective critical can also sometimes convey the very opposite of this virtuous disposition. Stop being so critical, you might protest to someone who constantly points out others' faults. Critics are carping, they're petulant, or worse yet, they're simply irrelevant, right? They're focused unduly on minutiae and details. So critical pedantry sometimes suggests this undue attention to sort of the academic nuts and bolts of things. These critics sometimes are not our heroes, but rather sometimes they can invite our derision. So one of the things I'd like to explore today is how the critic is someone who is at once valorized, heroized, and also despised. So, as Constanze mentioned in the introduction, when it comes to critics and their debunking of forgeries, one name is often invoked above all, and this is Lorenzo Valla, a celebrated Italian humanist of the 15th century, who exposed the so-called donation of Constantine as a fake. And in my time today, I want to emphasize some of the ways that he, or rather certain narratives about him, continue to frame our studies of forgery. So I'll spend a bit of time going into the details of his methods, but I also want to focus on how later generations have thought of him. That is, the qualities that they assign to him and to the task of criticism writ large, and what this means for how we think about, or indeed think with, forgery. Then in the second half, I'll touch on the Renaissance scholars who followed in his wake, particularly Erasmus of Rotterdam, who also exposed many texts as fake. And I'll close with a discussion of the French Jesuit scholar Jean Ardouin, who, around the turn of the 18th century, took the critic's task, we might say, rather a bit too far, and bizarrely claimed that nearly every ancient text was a fake. Ardouin's story offers us an example of what I might term the paradoxes of criticism. That is, when criticism, or rather the performance of criticism, itself becomes a kind of forgery, and in this case, the forging of a conspiracy theory about forgery itself. But first, back to Valla. The name Lorenzo Valla graces high school and college textbooks, starring in those pages devoted to the Renaissance. And here in the United States, he often appears on our high school advanced placement, or shortened to AP, European history exam. As a result, when one Googles his name, as seen here, one of the first suggestions is Lorenzo Valla, AP Euro, doubtless the result of countless high school students who are feverishly cramming for their test. And if one clicks on this, it takes us to one of many sites which offers a kind of study guide complete with flashcards. And here, as you can see, is the flashcard for Lorenzo Valla, who, among other attainments, is described as, and I quote, the father of modern historical criticism. So how did this reputation form over the centuries? So much so that high school students are still attempting to memorize it today. And just what does it mean to label someone the founding father of, quote, modern criticism? So Valla is often identified with the intellectual movement that we now term humanism. He wrote everything from a treatise on pleasure and a work on formal logic to notes on the New Testament and his biblical work I'm going to touch on in a moment, and also a handbook of Latin grammar. He even wrote a treatise on Latin reflexive pronouns, and that topic in particular might be one that exposes him to charges of pedantry. So in other words, focusing unduly on minutiae. But it was part of his task as a humanist who believed very strongly in restoring the Latin language to what he supposed was its original ancient purity. And moreover, as I'll show, this kind of close attention to linguistic phenomena informed the act of criticism for which he remains famous today. So this work, and as is often the case with these things, not something that he was famous for in his own day, but that he has become famous for thereafter. This work was his attack upon the so-called donation of Constantine, which Valla wrote around 1440, well employed by one of the Pope's opponents, Alfonso of Aragon. The donation purported to be written by Constantine, the first Christian Roman emperor, in the 4th century. And the gift or donation that it memorialized was, to put it mildly, as generous as it was sizable. So according to the story, Constantine recorded how the Pope at the time, Pope Sylvester I, had cured him of leprosy. And in exchange, the emperor gave the papacy the entire western half of the Roman Empire as a gift of gratitude. Now, although it claimed to have been written in the 4th century, in reality, the text was probably composed in the 8th century as a kind of post hoc justification for papal power and papal privileges. And I should add that Valla's attack was not the first time that the document had met with criticism, nor did his debunking prove earth-shattering in the moment. In fact, in what might strike us retrospectively as a kind of singular irony, several years later, Valla actually accepted a job with the papacy, the very institution whose claims to political power he had denounced as based upon a fraud. Given time constraints, I'm going to offer just a few quick examples of how Valla sought to demolish the donation. And some of these most famous examples of his method involve the identification of what we term anachronisms. That is, instances in which a text used language or mentioned an event that did not belong to its proper time. So, for example, the text of the donation referred to, quote, our satraps and the entire Senate. Now, a satrap satraps had been provincial governors in Persia or other Near Eastern states. Officials in the Roman imperial administration did not possess that name until long after the donation of Constantine. So to kind of give a contemporary example, this might be if someone was today forging say a government document and referred to something like the United States Parliament, or conversely, the European Union House of Representatives, right? So it's sort of mixing up nomenclature from one government to another. And when he saw this, Valla immediately pounced. And I quote, "You blockhead, you dolt! Do emperors talk that way? Are Roman decrees normally drafted like that? Who has ever heard of satraps being named in the deliberation of the Romans?" Now, in another example, which prompted Valla to utter the phrase that forms the title of my talk today, the donation had made mention of 4 cities that were central to early Christianity: Alexandria, Antioch, Jerusalem, and last but not least, Constantinople. However, this final reference proved a textbook case of anachronism. For of course, Constantinople was to Constantine as Alexandria was to Alexander the Great. That is, it was named by Constantine himself when he decided to found his new capital in the eastern half of the empire. Ergo, there was no way that the city could have yet borne that name when Constantine, purportedly still at Rome, was busy writing up this donation. And Valla, in a kind of aha moment, then made a show of connecting the dots. And I quote here, also seen here on the screen. "Who does not see that whoever composed the text of this grant lived long after the time of Constantine? When he wanted to embellish his falsehood, what he had said before escaped him. That is, that these events took place at Rome on the 3rd day after the emperor was baptized. And so the hoary old proverb applies very properly to him. Liars should have good memories." So unfortunately, the forger of the donation did not have a particularly good memory. One section of his document easily gave the lie to another. And here Valla used the principle of what we might understand as non-contradiction, or rather of self-evidence. And that is something that we might be familiar with from, say, detective novels or detective shows and the like. And that is, if you don't keep your story straight throughout, something you said earlier can be used against you. Right? So that in a sense, a text is sort of an interlocking web of evidence. And if all the pieces don't cohere with one another, then the critic can come and use one part of it against another. Now, I should say that although these are the kind of examples that are today sort of most famous about the donation, this was by no means the entirety of the text. And in fact, recently, scholars have also focused on what might strike us as some of the more surprising aspects of it, particularly the very colorful language that Valla uses to indict the forgery and by extension the forger. And I'll quote a few lines of it, which are really evocatively captured in Glenn Bowersock's English translation of Valla's Latin, I think from 2007. So just to give you sort of a taste of what it's like to read this document, and actually why it's something I often assign to students, and I find that it really makes for very lively reading in the classroom. So at one point, Valla announces, and I quote, "But now it is time to administer a mortal blow to my opponent's case, already battered and mangled, and to slice its throat with a single stroke." So Valla quite literally imagines this conflict between him and the author of this document as a kind of mortal struggle. He literally has his knives out, and he is ready for the forger's jugular. Now, this might not be how we might expect a sort of dispassionate or removed or rational sort of critic to talk, but this was integral to the proof that he offered. Elsewhere, he refers to the forger as a madman, and he addresses him directly. So this almost becomes, in a way, a kind of dramatic work. This becomes it uses the kind of techniques that we might associate with literary fiction. Valla says at one point, quote, "I prefer to attack him," that is the nameless forger of this document, "I prefer to attack him as if he were present before me." And so Valla acknowledged the need for some kind of fiction, right? Some kind of conceit, albeit a useful fiction. We might even say some kind of a forgery in the most capacious sense of that term to prosecute his case. And he even acknowledged the inadequacy of criticism itself. So at one point he exclaims, "With God as my witness, I cannot find the words, I cannot find the brutality of language for striking down this utterly shameless wretch. All the words he keeps spewing out are full of lunacy." So while this might strike us as hyperbolic, Valla seems to be expressing here that sometimes the forger's own words are so full of lunacy, that this forger is such a madman, that even the language of criticism is sort of not enough to match him. Now, attacking the donation may have invited conflict with the papacy, but it was not the same, or did not go as far, as applying these methods to a core Christian text like the Bible. However, Valla's treatise offers us some hints that he was willing to go there, at least briefly. So in this passage, in attacking the donation, he questioned a passage in which Constantine had described how he had placed the text of his grant, quote, "upon the venerable body of the blessed Peter." But here Valla, the close reader, wondered, how could someone write about something that they did after they had written it? And once he made this point, he drew a very telling analogy, which I put up on the screen here. He then added, quote, "When I was a boy," so already Valla remembering that as a young boy, he was already a critic in the making. "When I was a boy, I remember asking someone who had written the book of Job. When he answered Job himself, I asked the further question of how, therefore, he had managed to mention his own death." And then Valla adds, "This can be said of many other books, although it is not appropriate to discuss them here. For how can something that has not yet taken place be accurately told?" So, in other words, it defied common sense that one could narrate their own death. Yet in doing so, when applied to the books of the Bible, Valla hinted at criticism's potentially dangerous or damning implications. So, how does this example get taken up by slightly later scholars working in the Renaissance? One person who took up this task of biblical criticism was the famous Renaissance humanist Erasmus of Rotterdam. And here pictured on the right-hand side is the statue of Erasmus in Rotterdam today. So Valla had served as a kind of intellectual role model to Erasmus. He discovered a manuscript of Valla's aforementioned notes on the New Testament. And he had them printed in 1555. And there's the title page that you can see on the left. And he actually describes Valla here on the title page as one who is most skilled in both Greek and Latin. So sort of pointing out the linguistic attainments, the philological expertise that makes a critic sort of proficient at their task. And Valla set about systematically attempting to remove fakes, forgeries, and misattributions from both the Christian and the pagan canon. And he did this particularly when he published an edition of the early Christian writer, St. Jerome, and here he spoke at length about a whole slew of texts that he knew were fake. So whereas Valla sort of directs his energy at one particular text, Erasmus, in a sort of more systematic fashion, tries to show that this kind of forgery or misattribution or fakery in one form or another is a common problem across canons, again, across time. And he even in one particular passage here, very strikingly announces, and I quote, "The writer does not exist who has not had something falsely ascribed to him." So I'll mention just a few examples that Erasmus cites here. The lines of Homer, he points out, were full of later additions or interpolations. There were numerous works in the Aristotelian corpus that were in fact not by Aristotle. In fact, it was oftentimes very easy to just put the name of Aristotle upon a philosophical treatise. He also says, quote, "How many writings have usurped the name of Virgil, which the most convincing arguments show to be the work of others?" He also took aim at a series of letters that were supposedly exchanged between St. Paul and the Roman philosopher Seneca. And remarking sort of upon this unlikely meeting or this unlikely exchange, Erasmus says, quote, that these letters contain nothing at all worthy either of Paul or of Seneca. And also, in a sort of zinger that Valla would have appreciated, he took down a text that was attributed to the philosopher Boethius by scoffing that, quote, "a work about education circulates under the name of Severinus Boethius, that one might sooner say was the effort of a cowhand than the work of that distinguished philosopher." Then, after talking about sort of the classical texts, he also turned to biblical texts that he also said that were not by their purported authors. Quote, "Most say that the second letter of St. Peter did not originate with him, and today 3 letters are read almost everywhere and cited by almost everyone as the Apostle John's, although Jerome clearly states that only the first was his." So in other words, he's pointing out that various biblical texts are not always by the authors that they claim to be by. But here Erasmus made clear what a delicate line he was threading between criticism on the one hand and religious orthodoxy on the other. For he then quickly added, by way of amendment, quote, "In the case of those writings, however, that belong to the canon," referring to the biblical canon, "we simply accept with love, as a Christian should, the pronouncements of ecclesiastical authority." Now, putting aside the prospect of getting into trouble, what was the solution to this problem? That is, of texts not actually written by the authors that they claimed. Could everybody be as lucky as Valla or Erasmus and sort of sniff out falsehood with confidence and certainty? The best way to counter these fakes, so Erasmus suggested, was for the critic to cultivate what we might think of as a kind of connoisseurship. One needed to know, quote, "the character and the quality of speech of a given author." And then you could use that to ascertain whether or not they had really written a given text. And this is just one of many examples of, this is the passage in question. And I just put this up on the slide to show one of many examples of how Renaissance readers very closely annotated these passages. So in a way, kind of trying to learn the practices of criticism from Erasmus. So character and quality referred to an author's style. But Erasmus did not mean style in the narrow sense of the term. And in a really striking passage a little bit later, he says, and I quote, "When I speak of style, I do not understand simply the surface of language, the skin, as it were, or the veneer of words of a figure or of a figure of speech. Rather, Erasmus's conception of style went below the surface, right? It went below the skin, and it was thus something all the more ineffable or indescribable. Stylistic criticism of this sort was at once as simple to perform and as difficult to describe as the recognition of a face. And he then says, and I quote, "As each individual has their own appearance, their own voice, their own character and disposition, so each has their own style of writing." And so, right, if we think about it, if something like facial recognition that sort of evades sometimes our linguistic abilities to describe it, this is what Erasmus is saying each text, each kind of literary text has. In effect, he sought to generalize the principle that Valla had employed when he determined that something like the donation of Constantine lacked the voice, the character, and the disposition of Constantine himself. And this is also indeed, I think, something that is not just applicable to literary text or even to text, but rather similar to some of the ways in which critics describe the detection of forgery in the realm of the visual arts, right? Saying that maybe this painting does not quite have that certain ineffable something that a given artist possesses. So, of course, this was one of the easiest things to describe in theory and one of the very hardest to accomplish in practice. Criticism depended upon connoisseurship, an assertion that, as we might say, quote, "I know it when I see it." It was an acquired skill, a craft, and like so many crafts, it was, and here to invert another old maxim, it was actually easier done than said. In the 17th century, the Benedictine scholar Jean Mabillon, seen here, took this Erasmian idea one step further. What Erasmus had applied to language and words, he now applied to their visual material form as handwriting. He turned those methods upon the problem of forged charters and other documents from the Middle Ages. And this was a huge issue in scholarship, was how to sort of authenticate charters and other medieval documents. And here's just an example of the wonderful sort of guide to reading these things that Mabillon assembles. So in other words, Mabillon was one of the founders of the discipline that we call paleography, that is the historical study of handwriting. And in 1681, he compiled a comprehensive handbook on the subject. So if a charter claimed, for instance, that it was written in the 12th century, the way to verify it was to determine whether its script, its handwriting, belonged to the 12th century. And indeed, as the historian Marc Bloch described it, he described the year of Mabillon's publication as, quote, "the decisive moment in the history of the critical method." But how did someone establish enough data points about, say, genuine 12th century writing to be able to recognize an impostor? In a later supplement to his handbook, Mabillon, like Erasmus, spoke of criticism as ineffable. And here I quote, "Of course, there is no class of writers in which the false and the spurious works are not found mixed with true and genuine ones. Neither historical works, nor the writings of the fathers, nor decretal letters, nor the records of councils, nor the lives of the saints, out of reverence I shall be silent about Scripture, were immune from this blemish. In what way will you distinguish the true from the false? Only by the testimony of the ancients, by the comparison of suspect works with genuine ones, and finally by a certain taste, in Latin a quodam gustu, which is acquired by constant reading of the genuine works of each author." So, like Valla and Erasmus, Mabillon noted the dangerous religious implications of this kind of criticism, right? He sort of tiptoes around the question of applying it to the Bible. But more generally, he acknowledged that his method raised a kind of hermeneutic circle. In other words, how did one know that the genuine works, right, the ones that were used to judge the false ones false, were themselves genuine? So, to return to Erasmus's example, how could one distinguish between the real Boethius and that cowherd impostor without some agreement that the real Boethius was actually real? In Mabillon's estimation, It was a matter of taste, cultivation of this certain taste. And in the 20th century, I'll just mention actually the semiotician and the novelist Umberto Eco described this conundrum, I think, really wonderfully when in his own writings on the subject of forgery. And I'll just quote him briefly here. Quote, "The current notion of a fake presupposes a, quote, true original with which the fake should be compared. But every criterion for ascertaining whether something is the fake of an original coincides with the criteria for ascertaining whether the original is authentic." So in other words, we're caught here in a circle. And Eco offers us a cautionary tale about criticism's own logical poverty. It revealed in his words, and I quote, "how much such concepts as truth and falsity, authentic and fake, identity and difference circularly define one another." So, while we might now know that this circular situation leaves us vulnerable to forgery, it also helps to explain some of the paradoxes of criticism. And so in a moment, I'm going to turn to someone who took these paradoxes to an extreme. But first, I want to say a few words about how Valla and Erasmus, the supposed sort of heroes and founders of modern criticism, came to earn that vaunted status. So already in the world of the 18th century Enlightenment, and in fact much earlier, and I can talk more about this in the Q&A, Valla, Erasmus, and many of their other humanists had been canonized as inaugurators of a new form of criticism. For instance, the historian Edward Gibbon, seen here, celebrated Erasmus as, quote, "the father of rational theology," and he credited his disciples with having, quote, "diffused a spirit of freedom and of moderation across Europe." He spoke of Valla in still more soaring terms. Gibbon marveled at the credulity of a world that once, back in the past, had taken the donation of Constantine at face value. But then he triumphantly recounted how this world had yielded to reason. Quote, "In the revival of letters and liberty, that fictitious deed," so the donation, "was transpierced by the pen of Laurentius Valla, the pen of an eloquent critic and a Roman patriot. His contemporaries of the 15th century were astonished at his sacrilegious boldness. Yet such is the silent and irresistible progress of reason, that before the end of the next age, that fable was rejected by the contempt of historians and poets, and the tacit or modest censure of the advocates of the Roman Church." So, in other words, Gibbon judges this gradual acceptance, even by the church, even by those who had a stake in the donation, as proof of what he terms the silent and irresistible progress of reason. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, praise of Valla grew still more pointed, particularly in the world of Anglo-American scholarship. He became the critic par excellence, who bravely pursued truth regardless of the consequences. In his study of the Renaissance, the English poet and scholar John Addington Symonds, as seen here, much like Gibbon before him, linked Valla to, quote, "humanistic freedom of thought." In Valla, according to Symonds, this free thinking, quote, "put on the sterner mask of common sense and criticism." And in doing so, it inspired nothing less than the reason of the modern world. Here, in his tellingly titled study of, quote, "the beginnings of modern Europe," first published in 1917, the American historian Ephraim Emerton lauded Valla for, quote, "his extreme development of the critical spirit." As he maintained, criticism for Valla was, quote, "not merely a means, but an end in itself." In other words, Valla performed criticism for criticism's sake. And as a result, he did not flinch when going after, quote, "the most cherished traditions of the past." So according to this view, the critic was not just one who deployed a particular method. Rather, they also possessed a particular spirit. The critic wasn't just a connoisseur, but also an iconoclast. And these are just a few other examples of the sort of praise, highly sort of laudatory language about Valla and criticism from other authors. I'm happy to talk more about this in the Q&A. But what of criticism when it's taken too far? So in closing, I'd like to turn briefly to the aforementioned Jean Ardouin, who was described here, as you can see, actually in his epitaph, not only as, quote, the most paradoxical of men, but also, quote, as the worshiper and destroyer of venerable antiquity. In the years around 1700, this French Jesuit scholar declared something truly startling. The entire corpus of ancient Greco-Roman and early Christian texts were forgeries. And so indirectly, he actually inspires this wonderful satirical article in the parody site, The Onion. But Ardouin had noticed discrepancies between ancient literary texts and objects such as coins. And he also feared that not all texts from the early Christian church supported current Catholic orthodoxy. And so, as a result, he embraced conspiracy theorizing. According to his reasoning, the only truly genuine ancient works were those of, and I quote, Homer, Herodotus, Plautus, Pliny, Virgil, and Horace. And don't ask me how he comes up with this list, but those are the lucky few authors that make the cut. And startlingly, everything else he declared a fake, concocted by a cabal of medieval Benedictine monks whom he labeled secret atheists. He repeatedly referred to these Benedictines as an impious gang or an impious band, and he described their methods in detail. Quote, he says, quote, a vast number of volumes was prepared because the wicked forgers knew that the more there were, the more difficult it would be to unravel the fraud. So in other words, Ardouin deployed an entire set of what today we might label alternative facts, and he did so in the name of criticism. So in other words, he imagines, he forges, as it were, a kind of forgery factory where all the works that we think of as genuine ancient texts are in fact medieval forgeries. So striking for my purposes today is how Ardouin denied the genuineness of those very genuine texts that everyone from Valla and Erasmus to Mabillon had used to prove fake texts fake. In other words, his default assumption was not that most texts were real and a few false, but rather that most were false and only a few were real. And here's a passage in which he even describes how these forgers could have gotten parchment and ink and aged them so that they would look as though they were more ancient than they really were. Right, so he kind of, in this very fevered, almost sort of paranoid state, imagines how even handwriting could be forged. But still more curiously, he presented his kind of criticism as, for want of a better word, modern. In other words, he too did not mind, in fact, he relished the fact that he was striking against those cherished traditions of the past, much as Valla or the other heroes of criticism were said to do. And he argued here by way of a prologue, knowing full well how improbable his theory would seem, that it was okay that no one else had proposed it before. What matters is that no one before my time has said what I have just said, and that I adduce no authority or witness from the ancients in my support. Supposing that I had had a forerunner, would that affect the question of truth? Or because he had long passed away, would that render him worthier of support? I pray you not to believe in men, but in sound arguments. So tradition versus arguments, ancients versus moderns. This was an old story, but with a new twist. Of course, few found Ardouin's arguments sound, and in contrast to Valla the hero, he has gone down in history as a crank. But as we encounter forgery, we would do well to understand that its criticism also has a history, and that it too sometimes contains paradoxes. When criticism becomes hypercriticism, as in the case of Ardouin, it can become sometimes something like forgery under another name. After all, the Gibbon's, quote, silent and irresistible progress of reason has never been linear. If forgery constitutes an albeit deceitful attempt to create meaning, so too are the stories that we tell about attempts to combat or debunk it. As Valla admonishes us, liars should have good memories. But the persistence of forgery, well into modernity and indeed into our own troubled age of misinformation, of denialism, of conspiracy theorizing anew, reminds us that so too should those have good memories who seek forms of truth, whether critical, historical, or otherwise. Thank you very much. And I will stop sharing.
Thank you, Professor Clark. It was a pleasure listening to these connections between people and ideas and forgeries and critics and how everything gets connected and explained and how they feed each other. And I guess a lot of the discussion would be around this these ideas. So I would start with a question of my own, although we have already started receiving questions from the audience. So in our Fake for Real exhibition, we have very much hoped to introduce this kind of nuanced thinking about fake, because we live in an era where, I mean, it's probably not specific to this era, but this demonization of fake and forgery, this fear, this immense fear that fake news, for example, are triggering, that sometimes it feels like that it's the only possible enemy and the worst thing that you can say about some idea or some news, that it's fake news, and we know that it's overly abused. So I think that one of the defenses against this thing is a more nuanced approach to fakes and forgeries, which is exactly what you are doing and what we try to do in the exhibition. So my question was, if we were to think of a world without fakes and forgeries, can you think about such a thing? And is this a utopia or rather a dystopia? Is this something that we want? Because I think that we might reach some interesting paths of thought if we go along this line, because of course we want to debunk forgeries, and some of the examples that you gave had very nice arguments about why it's so important to debunk them and to show them as forgeries. But what is the ultimate purpose? Because maybe it's not to totally delete fakes and forgeries. So that's my question, I guess. Is it like, just to spice it up, like the relation between life and death, you know?
Right,
they say
exactly.
that, like, yes, life we appreciate, we treasure life because death exists, and this because death makes life what it is. Is it the same with fakes, or is it even more? Is it are they fake and truth and authenticity? Because you also brought that in, which is also a bit of a nuanced.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's a wonderful question and it's a really, I think it's a question that speaks that speaks across this broad span of historical dealing with fakes, or perhaps, for want of a better term, also with fictions of various sorts. And I think what you've touched upon is something that is very important for the historical study of forgery. And I think one of the insights that we can take from forgery studies is that studying a forged text or a false text from the sort of perspective of cultural history can actually give us a perhaps distorted, but because of that very distortion, a more insightful picture into the particular sort of historical and cultural conditions that produced that, or that rendered a document like that necessary. So I think, for instance, and this is something that I try to tell students when encountering, say, the donation of Constantine, we read the donation itself, and then we read Valla's attack upon it. And we also think about what are some of the ways in which, once we sort of put aside or bracket, as it were, this question of its authorship or its, I suppose, authenticity, how can we actually use that text to sort of understand it as a medieval document that is describing a particular cultural world in which, say, the papacy is trying to assert itself, to, in other words, use it as a kind of window into that time. And I think this is something that medieval scholars sometimes speak of some of these also forged documents under the category of the sort of the pious fraud. So for instance, say maybe some monasteries that were attempting to establish the sort of deep antiquity of their foundation. And we can almost sort of read these documents as windows into the need for a kind of past, the need for a kind of venerable antiquity. And so I was sort of thinking about that when looking at Ardouin's epitaph as both the worshiper and the destroyer of venerable antiquity. And I think that one of the tools that we can get by kind of thinking with forgery is to understand precisely the very rich and sometimes perplexing ways in which human beings have attempted to construct pasts for themselves. And even if those pasts are constructed in the most literal sense of the term, even if they don't correspond necessarily to the historical record as we've been able to reconstruct it, they give us a window into sort of what kinds of, I suppose, tools or ideologies or kind of cultural practices people have and invest those in the past. So Marc Bloch, who I cited with respect to Mabillon, also describes this kind of belief in origins as, I think he calls it something like the beginning that explains. And so the idea that all of these texts are attempting in one way or another to fashion these beginnings and to use an imagined past as a way of sort of describing their present. So I think, yeah, that might be one way forward of thinking about what are, how can we kind of read behind the forgery and in a sense try to understand what it is that the forger or the fabricator or the one who creates fiction is trying to achieve.
Thank you for the answer. We also believe, the curators of the Fake for Real exhibition, that we can learn a lot about European history, at least because this is what we are displaying here. We can learn a lot about history by using the fakes and forgeries that each era produced, and our exhibition is very much about that. And I was thinking when you mentioned this pious forgeries, I was thinking about the patriotic fakes that we discussed also in an online lecture with Professor Joop Legersen, which is it's a different kind of purpose, but it's, I mean, fundamentally it's the same thing. So in medieval time, you would have the need for a religious past, as you explain it, for religious legitimation, and for and in 18th, 19th century, you already have the need for a national past, and you use forgery as a tool to achieve that. And speaking of the need for a past, we have a very nice question from the audience, which says, if you were to write a history of fakes and forgeries, what would you start with? Is there anything like a primordial fake, a first forgery? What is, again, a play question, just first things that come to mind?
Oh, that's wonderful. That's really wonderful. Yeah, I think that in some ways we can think of forgery as providing these kind of lost connections or points of continuity that help to explain away what might be otherwise unsettling ruptures in the historical past. And I think particularly sort of maybe thinking about some of the examples I touched upon today. You know, say for instance, something like the forged letters between Seneca and Paul represent this attempt to try to impose a kind of continuity or unity or a synthesis, quite literally, between paganism and Christianity. Or even the donation of Constantine, we might also think of as an attempt to impose a kind of political continuity, as a way to sort of explain how what might otherwise seem like a very dramatic discontinuity, right? The sort of end of the old Roman Empire and the emergence of these sort of new political powers, including the papacy in medieval Europe, as a way to sort of explain that continuity. So in other words, we could tell a history in reverse, as it were, where we go back and look at all the ways in which forged texts in one way or another have sought to provide continuities between otherwise gaps or ruptures, turning points in the past. And to get back, right, to take this all the way back to a first forgery. And actually, this is a wonderful question, because the book that I wrote about the first pagan historian explores precisely this question. It's sort of a case study in the long history of the reception and the use of a forgery. But the text that I looked at claims to be an eyewitness account of the Trojan War. And it very quickly, the early medieval encyclopedist Isidore of Seville, writing in the 7th century, refers to Dares as the first pagan historian. He says that Moses is the first historian, quote, among us. So sort of trying to draw a parallel between biblical history and pagan history. And he says, and Dares is the first historian amongst the pagans. And it really struck me, actually, thinking about this, how you've also used the Trojan horse as a sort of symbol, a broader symbol for this exhibit. And I think it's very interesting, actually, when thinking about first forgeries, to think about the ways in which an event like the Trojan War was often read as this kind of moment, this kind of one of the sort of first, not just a moment that provides incredible fodder for literary productions, poetic works like those of Homer and Virgil, but also in the Middle Ages, sort of following the Roman example, so many different peoples claim actual literal sort of genealogical descent from the Trojans. So again, it connects with this idea of these sort of patriotic forgeries, or these forgings of a kind of proto-national past. So in the book, I kind of explore the ways in which this fake eyewitness account functions as exactly that kind of this idea of a first forgery, or perhaps I might even change it a little bit and say it's a forging of a first, and that firstness, that idea of being an originator, of a founder, and various people who interpret this text start talking about what does it mean for this figure Dares to have, in a sense, kind of invented history. And we might take invention in all senses of that term. His status as a first becomes extremely important for later readers. So I think we might kind of think about the need for a first, and how that itself becomes, as it were, a catalyst for the production of forgeries, and how forgeries in turn reinforce our desire to have that kind of that original document, and to fill in, I think to fill in the gaps of the sort of unsatisfying gaps that exist in history, and to deal with the fact that so much of the very distant past remains kind of shrouded in in unknowing, or in that we have a lack of information about the distant past. That's a great question.
Yeah, we as a species are not very good at handling the unknown, I guess. So that's where forgery, among other things, comes in. Also, science and systems of knowledge, but also forgery. So we also have a question that's more specific about the Valla's debunking. So we are going back to the Renaissance. The question is, Valla paid a price for his text, but not so severe as it could have been in comparison to other critics of the church. Why? Did he win many people of the church by his arguments, or this only came later? So how did he survive his becoming the father of modern historical criticism? Why was he not hanged for that?
Right. That's a really fascinating question. And I think that one of the things that happens to Valla, and this is sort of unfortunately, in sort of jumping from Valla's own life to the 18th century, this was sort of a bit that I didn't have time to include in the talk, but it is a fascinating chapter in the story. It's really not till about, I would say, a century after he writes the document that it becomes sort of activated in a particular kind of way. And this is the context of the Reformation. So when he writes this attack against the donation, of course the papacy isn't happy, but then there's a new pope. He comes back and gets a job. It kind of, he also has, like many of the sort of humanists who worked in the context of the papal court, he has, amazing skills as a Latinist. He's sort of he's sort of very good at sort of the humanist part of the job. But what happens later is that beginning in the 16th century, German humanists get very interested posthumously in Valla's attack against the donation. And there's this humanist, Ulrich von Hutten, who actually publishes and prints his attack on the donation of Constantine. And it becomes, in a sense, a kind of proto-Reformation text. It becomes it functions sort of in its afterlife as something that's more incendiary, I suppose, than it was in its original life. And it gets picked up particularly sort of by Lutherans who are challenging the papacy. And this causes a sort of much more, I suppose, severe reaction than in the Catholic Church to Valla. And there are even some fascinating examples of 16th century Catholic scholars who write these attacks on Valla and on Valla's own attack on the donation. So in a sense, I think this is something that happens so often in the history of criticism, which is that a critic might attack something in their immediate context, and it might cause problems, but not, literally become an issue of life and death. But then in the following century, when sort of religious conflict, sort of divides Europe into these sort of warring confessional camps, then it does quite literally become this issue of life and death.
We are very quickly approaching the end because we promised to stop after 1 hour. So I would just like to close with a question we have about Erasmus of Rotterdam and the fact, despite being one of the leaders of this criticism movement, he was a forger himself, and he published these writings of Saint Cyprian, which were actually, I would link it to the title of your lecture with a twist, because there you quote from Valla saying that liars should have good memories, but maybe liars should be good historians. And I just want to push you more into this and tell us, why do you think this connection is so? Why do we find so many forgers between established scholars? Is it if you studied it or not, I don't know, but what happened at what point in their gaining of knowledge about how forgeries are made? Do they decide that they could attempt it themselves? Because I was struck by this fragment that you quote from, who was it? Was it Mabillon? No. The last author you mentioned, where he literally describes how you could forge these antique writings. Like it's like it looks like a recipe. So you're wondering if did he really do it or not? So
no, that's
forgers and historians. What's the connection there?
And that I think in a way, and that's actually one of the, and that's a wonderful example that the questioner points out, about Erasmus. And actually, in Grafton's Forgers and Critics, he has this wonderful discussion of that, of the ways in which the critic, in essence, can become sort of the ideal forger. And I think part of it is sort of not just having the sort of tools. And so we can almost see someone like Ardoin sort of, fantasizing about how he would do it. In his very attempt to say, this is how everything we think is true was actually falsified. You can almost see this kind of, this fantasy of sort of like, how to pull off this sort of perfect heist, as it were. But I think there's also this connection to this idea of loss, of the loss of many ancient texts. And another example of a Renaissance humanist scholar in the 16th century who gets accused of doing this is the Italian humanist Carlo Segonio, who is obsessed with Cicero, and he is actually one of the people who begins the serious study of historical fragments. And so he publishes a volume of fragments of Cicero from various other works that he can find, sort of Cicero's lost or incomplete works. Then several decades later, he comes out with what he says is a rediscovered text of Cicero's Consolation, which is a text that he wrote on the death of his daughter, which unfortunately does not survive. And Segonio then sort of claims that he found it, and then other people say, well, it seems like he actually invented it, you know, and it almost, I suppose, raises this really interesting question of forgery as a type of homage, or forgery as a desire to make kind of what we were talking about earlier. Forgery is a desire to make close that which is unfortunately distant. And people like Erasmus or people like Segonio or many of these humanist scholars who become so deeply attuned to sort of, I suppose, what Erasmus describes as sort of, you know, the character and quality of an ancient author's speech, maybe begin to see the ways that they themselves can do it. Although unfortunately, many people pointed out actually that they thought that Segonio's Latin was, you know, not comparable to Cicero's, but perhaps he would have disputed that. But again, yeah, that sense of, I suppose, forgery as a way of getting us closer to a past that is unfortunately lost.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we have to stop here. There are a few more questions that I could not pass on because then it would become too long. I want to thank you, Professor Clark, very much for this lecture, to welcome you again to our events, and to welcome our listeners to the House of European History, to the Fake for Real exhibition, which fortunately is available also virtually. So there is a playlist of virtual guided tours by the curators of the exhibition that you can look up on the YouTube page of the House of European History or on the website of the House of European History. And there will still be events connected to this fascinating history of fakes and forgeries, and to this field of forgery studies that we didn't get to mention, but it's something that's existing, that's real, that's growing, and also maybe something to think about and telling about our age that we. So thank you so much, and
thank you, Simina. Yeah, thank you so much for this, and thank you, thank you for all the questions, and to anyone whose questions we didn't get to, please feel free to email me, or I would love to continue the conversation in other formats.